Imagine a machine that could give you any experience you desire. A perfect life, perfectly simulated. Every joy, every triumph, every moment of love and accomplishment, all yours forever, without risk or pain. In 1974, a philosopher posed this thought experiment and discovered something startling almost no one wanted to plug in. The machine Robert Nozick described was simple in concept. Neuroscientists would stimulate your brain to give you any experience you chose. You could write the great novel you have always dreamed of writing, form profound friendships, accomplish extraordinary things, feel the rush of achievement and the warmth of love. The experiences would be indistinguishable from reality. You would not know you were in the machine. You would simply live, subjectively, the best possible life. And yet when Nozick asked people whether they would choose this existence, nearly everyone said no. They would rather live in reality, with all its disappointments and pain, than accept even perfect happiness if it meant living in an illusion. This rejection revealed something unexpected about human nature. It suggested that we value more than just our conscious experiences, more than pleasure and positive mental states. We seem to care about something else entirely, something about reality itself, about authenticity, about the actual doing of things rather than merely the feeling of having done them. The experience machine became one of the most influential thought experiments in modern philosophy, not because it offered answers, but because it revealed a mystery about what makes life worth living. Tonight we will explore why this imaginary machine has haunted philosophy for 50 years. We will examine Robert Nozick himself, the Brooklyn-born philosopher who arrived at Harvard just as debates about justice and freedom were reshaping political thought. We will trace the argument he embedded in his most famous book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which won the National Book Award in 1974 and became a libertarian landmark. We will follow the experience machine as it escaped its original context and wandered through debates about consciousness, virtual reality, and the nature of the good life. And we will discover why a thought experiment designed to refute hedonism has become eerily relevant in an age of increasingly immersive technology, when the machine Nozick imagined as pure hypothesis edges closer to engineering possibility. The story begins with a simple observation that almost everyone shares. When presented with the choice between reality and perfect simulated experience, something in us recoils. Nozick gave 3 reasons for this rejection. First, we want to do certain things, not merely have the experience of doing them. There is a difference between actually writing a novel and having the experience of writing one, between truly forming a friendship and merely feeling as if you had. Second, we want to be certain ways, to actually possess characteristics like courage, kindness, or creativity, not simply to experience what it would feel like to possess them. Third, and perhaps most mysteriously, we want contact with a deeper reality. We do not want to live in a world that exists only in our own minds, no matter how pleasant that world might be. We want the world to push back, to be genuinely there, independent of our perception of it. These intuitions, Nozick argued, refute the ancient philosophical position known as hedonism, the view that pleasure and the absence of pain are the only things that ultimately matter. If hedonism were true, we should eagerly plug into the experience machine. The fact that we do not suggests that we value things other than our own mental states. We value truth. We value authenticity. We value actual connection to a real world. But why? What is it about reality itself that matters so much? Why should the source of an experience affect its value if the experience itself is identical? These questions rippled outward from Nozick's original argument. They connected to ancient puzzles about appearance and reality, to Plato's allegory of prisoners in a cave who mistake shadows for substance. They raised new questions about virtual reality and digital experience. They complicated utilitarian ethics, which seemed to imply that if we could maximize happiness through illusion, we should do so. The experience machine became a kind of philosophical mirror, reflecting back our deepest commitments about what makes life meaningful. Nozick himself was an unusual figure in academic philosophy. Born in 1938 in Brooklyn to Jewish immigrants from Russia, He showed early brilliance in mathematics and debate. At Princeton in the early 1960s, he studied under the philosopher Carl Hempel and wrote a dissertation on decision theory, but his interests ranged widely, and his philosophical style was exploratory rather than dogmatic. He had a rare willingness to question his own conclusions, to treat philosophy not as a system of proofs, but as a genuine investigation. He wrote with unusual accessibility, using thought experiments and stories rather than formal arguments, and he had a gift for creating scenarios that revealed intuitions people did not know they had. The experience machine appeared in Anarchy, State and Utopia, Nozick's response to his Harvard colleague John Rawls, whose theory of justice had argued for an egalitarian distribution of resources. Nozick defended a minimal state that protected rights, but did not redistribute wealth. The book made him a hero to libertarians and a target for egalitarians. But the experience machine transcended that political debate. It wandered into philosophy of mind, ethics, theories of well-being, and eventually into conversations about technology and consciousness that Nozick could not have fully anticipated. Because here is what makes the thought experiment genuinely unsettling. The machine is no longer purely hypothetical. We have virtual reality headsets that create immersive experiences. We have neuroscience that can stimulate pleasure centers in the brain directly. We have social media and video games that offer carefully designed experiences of achievement, connection, and meaning. We do not yet have the full experience machine Nozick imagined, but we have fragments of it, and those fragments are growing more sophisticated. The question is no longer entirely academic. It is becoming practical, urgent, even unavoidable. What would Nozick make of this world, where millions of people spend hours each day in virtual spaces, where the boundary between digital and physical experience grows increasingly porous? He died in 2002, just as the internet was beginning its transformation into an immersive environment. But the machine he imagined in 1974 lives on, asking its question with renewed force. What do you actually value? What makes life worth living? And would you trade reality for perfect happiness? The answer most people give has remained consistent for 50 years. No, they would not plug in, but explaining why turns out to be far more difficult than stating the intuition. And that difficulty reveals something profound about human nature, about the relationship between experience and meaning, about what we lose when we mistake the feeling of living well for the actual doing of it. The experience machine offers us everything we think we want. Our rejection of it reveals what we truly need. But to understand why this machine troubled philosophy so deeply, we need to meet the man who built it, not with wires and circuits, but with words and reasoning. Picture a room somewhere. In the corner stands a device no larger than a stereo cabinet, unremarkable in its housing but extraordinary in its promise. Inside this machine rests technology capable of delivering any experience you might desire. Not crude virtual reality, not approximate simulation, perfect, indistinguishable replication of every sight, sound, sensation, and emotion that comprises human experience. Neuroscientists have solved the problem of consciousness from the outside. They can stimulate your brain so precisely that the machine-generated experiences feel exactly like real ones, because to your neurons, they are real ones. Every sunset you witness in the machine produces the same cascade of neural activity as an actual sunset. Every conversation, every achievement, every moment of joy or love or triumph creates identical patterns in your cortex. The technology is flawless. The illusion is perfect. Here is what the machine offers. You lie down. Technicians attach electrodes to your skull while you float in a tank, suspended and safe. Supercomputers will feed your brain a lifetime of experiences chosen from a vast library of possibilities. You can be a brilliant novelist whose books change millions of lives. You can be an adventurer who climbs mountains and crosses deserts. You can experience deep friendships, passionate romances, intellectual breakthroughs. You can have as much pleasure as a human nervous system can process. The experiences are pre-programmed but feel spontaneous. You will not know you are in the machine. From your perspective, You will simply be living an extraordinarily fortunate life. No one outside can bother you. Nothing can harm you. You cannot fail at anything unless you have chosen failure as part of your experience set. Pain exists only if you want it to, and only in carefully controlled doses that add texture without real suffering. Your body will be maintained while you drift in the tank. The machine will keep you alive for decades. When you eventually die of old age, long after you would have died outside, your last moments will be whatever you want them to be, peaceful, surrounded by loved ones. Watching the sun set over water, your final thought will be satisfaction at a life fully lived. Now the question, would you plug in? Robert Nozick posed this thought experiment in 1974 in a book called Anarchy, State and Utopia. The book argued for libertarian political philosophy, defending the minimal state against demands for redistributive justice. The experience machine appeared in a chapter attacking hedonism, the philosophical view that pleasure is the only intrinsic good, that happiness is all that ultimately matters. Hedonism has ancient pedigree. Epicurus argued that pleasure and the absence of pain constitute the good life. Jeremy Bentham built an entire ethical system on the principle that actions are right insofar as they promote happiness, wrong insofar as they produce suffering. Utilitarians believed they had found the objective measure of morality in units of pleasure and pain. If happiness is what we truly seek, then morality becomes a matter of maximizing total happiness in the world. Nozick thought this was wrong, not just philosophically mistaken but demonstrably false, and he believed the experience machine could prove it. His reasoning was simple. If hedonists are correct that pleasure is all we care about, then the machine should be irresistible. It offers unlimited pleasure, carefully calibrated experiences of achievement and connection, every positive mental state a human can have. A hedonist has no grounds for refusing. The machine delivers exactly what they claim constitutes a good life. Yet when Nozick asked people whether they would plug in, nearly everyone said no, not after careful deliberation. Immediately, instinctively, decisively, the refusal was visceral. This response has remained consistent for 50 years across cultures, ages and philosophical backgrounds. Surveys of students, philosophers, random adults on the street, all yield the same result. Roughly 90% say they would not enter the machine, even for perfect happiness, even when the alternative is an ordinary life with ordinary struggles, genuine disappointments, and no guarantee of fulfillment. The rejection is so universal that it functions as a kind of philosophical data point. Whatever humans value, it cannot be reducible to pleasant experiences, because we turn down the chance for maximal pleasant experiences when offered. Nozick identified 3 reasons for our refusal, 3 things we seem to want beyond pleasure. First, we want to actually do certain things, not merely have the experience of doing them. There is a difference between climbing a mountain and having the sensation of climbing a mountain. Both might feel identical from the inside, but one involves your body moving through actual space, muscles straining against gravity, rock beneath your hands. The other involves electrical impulses stimulating the same neural patterns while you float motionless in a tank. We care about that difference. Second, we want to be a certain way, to be a certain kind of person. Someone floating in a tank is not courageous. Regardless of what experiences of courage they enjoy, they are not a good friend, even if their simulated friendships feel deep and authentic. Character requires action in the world. Virtue must be earned through real choices with real consequences. The machine cannot make you wise or brave or kind, because those qualities describe what you are, not what you feel. Third, and this is perhaps deepest, we want contact with actual reality, not a constructed replica, however perfect. We want to connect to something beyond our own nervous system, a world that exists whether we perceive it or not. Other minds that are genuinely other, not clever simulations. The thought of spending decades in elaborate self-stimulation strikes us not as paradise but as a kind of sophisticated imprisonment, a gilded cage constructed from our own neurons. These 3 desires reveal that pleasure cannot be what we ultimately seek. We reject the machine not because it fails to deliver happiness, but because it delivers nothing else. It gives us experiences without reality, feelings without substance, the sensation of living well without the actual doing of it. The implications ripple outward. If hedonism is false, then utilitarianism requires significant revision. We cannot judge actions purely by their effects on happiness, if happiness is not all we value. A society that maximizes pleasure while ignoring freedom, truth, or authenticity would be missing something essential to human flourishing. The machine shows us a kind of happiness we do not want, which means happiness cannot be the sole measure of a good life. But the machine also creates a philosophical puzzle. Why should the source of an experience matter if the experience itself is identical? If machine-generated love produces the same joy as actual love, activates the same neural circuits, creates the same memories and satisfactions, then what exactly are we objecting to? The stipulation of the thought experiment is that you cannot tell the difference from inside, so the difference must be something you cannot experience, something about the relationship between your mental states and external reality. This raises uncomfortable questions. How do you know you are not already in an experience machine? Right now, reading these words, how can you be certain your brain is receiving information from actual photons reflected off actual paper or screens, rather than being fed machine-generated sensory data? Descartes worried about an evil demon who might be deceiving him about everything. The experience machine is the modern version of that worry, made more troubling because the machine is not malicious, it is trying to make you happy. Most people insist they would not plug in, but the thought experiment also asks whether you would unplug if you discovered you were already inside. That version is harder. You have relationships in the machine, a life, memories of achievements, all fake, but you cannot tell. Unplugging means abandoning everything you think you are for an unknown reality that might be far worse. The psychological difference between choosing to enter and choosing to leave is substantial, even though logically the situations seem equivalent. Nozick offered the machine as a reductio ad absurdum of hedonism. The argument is elegant. Hedonism says pleasure is all that matters. The machine provides maximal pleasure. We reject the machine. Therefore, hedonism is false. But like many powerful thought experiments, this one proved more troubling than its creator perhaps anticipated. It did not just refute a philosophical theory about pleasure. It opened questions about the nature of reality, the grounds of meaning, and what it is we truly value when we value our lives. The machine sits there in the realm of pure hypothesis, offering everything our nervous system might want. That we refuse its gift tells us something about ourselves. That we struggle to articulate exactly why we refuse tells us something about how little we understand what makes existence meaningful. The gap between intuition and explanation becomes itself a philosophical problem. 50 years after Nozick imagined his thought experiment, the gap has not closed. The intuition remains powerful, the explanation remains elusive, and as technology advances toward making the machine less hypothetical, the question becomes more urgent with each passing year. What separates a life worth living from a perfect simulation of one, and why does that separation matter so much we would sacrifice happiness itself to maintain it? But to understand why this machine troubled philosophy so deeply, we need to meet the man who built it, not with wires and circuits but with words and reasoning. Robert Nozick was born on November 16, 1938, in a Brooklyn neighborhood where philosophical debate was not an academic luxury but a survival skill. His parents had arrived from Russia, part of that great wave of Jewish immigration that fled persecution and poverty for the uncertain promise of America. They settled in a world where everyone had an opinion and no one hesitated to defend it. The Talmudic tradition of argument, the socialist meetings in cramped apartments, the endless discussions over dinner about justice and fairness and what society owed its members. This was the air the young Nozick breathed. He was brilliant from the start, the kind of child whose teachers recognized something unusual in the speed of his thinking. Mathematics came easily. So did debate. By the time he reached Columbia University as an undergraduate, Nozick had absorbed the progressive politics of his upbringing as naturally as language. He was a socialist, committed to equality and redistribution, certain that philosophy could help build a more just world. These were not abstract commitments. They were woven into his identity, into his understanding of what it meant to be a decent person in an indecent world. But certainty, Nozick would discover, was not a stable condition for a genuinely philosophical mind. At Columbia, he studied philosophy with intensity and earned his degree in 1959. The natural next step was graduate school, and he chose Princeton, where the philosophy department offered both prestige and proximity to some of the most rigorous minds in analytic philosophy. There he would study under Karl Hempel, a titan of logical positivism who had fled Nazi Germany and brought with him a tradition of philosophical precision that insisted on clarity above all else. Hempel taught that philosophy done well looked more like science than poetry. Every claim had to be examined, every assumption questioned, every inference tested. Nozick thrived in this environment. His dissertation, completed in 1963, tackled the nature of decision theory and rational choice, technical work that required both mathematical sophistication and philosophical subtlety. But something else was happening during those Princeton years, something that would alter the entire trajectory of his thought. He was reading widely outside the mainstream of academic philosophy. He encountered the work of Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist, who argued that free markets were not just efficient, but epistemologically necessary, that no central planner could ever possess the distributed knowledge required to run an economy. He read John Locke's arguments about property rights and self-ownership. He discovered libertarian thinkers who claimed that justice was not about redistributing resources, but about protecting individual liberty. These ideas disturbed him. They challenged everything he had assumed about fairness and the proper role of the state. But Nozick possessed a quality rare in any human endeavor, and especially rare in philosophy. He was more committed to following arguments wherever they led than to defending positions he had already adopted. If the arguments for libertarianism were stronger than the arguments for socialism, and he was beginning to believe they were, then intellectual honesty demanded he change his mind. By the time he completed his doctorate, Nozick had undergone a political transformation. The socialist from Brooklyn had become a libertarian philosopher, convinced that individual rights trumped collective welfare, that voluntary exchange was morally superior to state coercion, that the question was not how to distribute society's resources, but by what right anyone claimed the authority to distribute them at all. This was not a popular position in the academic world of the 1960s. Philosophy departments leaned left, often sharply so. The civil rights movement was redefining American justice. The Vietnam War was forcing questions about state power and moral obligation. The counterculture was challenging every established norm. And into this turbulent landscape came Nozick with his insistence that taxation was equivalent to forced labor, that welfare programs violated rights, that the only legitimate state was a minimal night watchman state that protected property and enforced contracts, but did nothing more. In 1969, Harvard offered him a position. He accepted and found himself teaching in one of the most storied philosophy departments in the world. Down the hall was John Rawls, a gentle and methodical thinker who had spent years constructing an elaborate theory of justice as fairness. Rawls argued that a just society was one that rational people would choose if they did not know their place in it, if they stood behind what he called a veil of ignorance. From that original position, Rawls believed people would choose a society with robust protections for the worst off, with resources distributed to ensure everyone had a fair chance at a decent life. Rawls was completing his masterwork, A Theory of Justice, which would appear in 1971 and instantly become the most influential work of political philosophy in a generation. Nozick read it with admiration for its rigor and horror at its conclusions. Everything Rawls built seemed designed to justify precisely the kind of redistributive state that Nozick believed violated fundamental rights. The stage was set for an intellectual confrontation that would define political philosophy for decades. But Nozick understood something crucial. Arguing against Rawls required more than abstract theorizing about rights and liberties. It required showing that the moral intuitions undergirding egalitarian justice were mistaken at a deeper level. It required demonstrating that people did not actually value what Rawls and other egalitarians claimed they valued. He began constructing thought experiments. Philosophy had always used them. Plato's cave, Descartes' demon, the trolley problem. But Nozick wielded them with particular force. He imagined scenarios stripped of everything except the essential moral question, forcing readers to confront their intuitions directly. If you reject this conclusion in this case, he would ask, how can you accept that principle in general? The method was Socratic, relentless, and extraordinarily effective. He wrote quickly, with an unusual combination of technical sophistication and readable prose. Unlike many philosophers who hid behind jargon and formal notation, Nozick wanted to be understood. He believed philosophy should be accessible, not because it was simple, but because clarity was a moral obligation. If an idea could not be explained plainly, perhaps it was not as profound as it seemed. But there was something else distinctive about Nozick's approach, something that would become more pronounced as his career progressed. He refused to treat philosophy as a battle to be won. Other philosophers constructed systems and defended them against all objections, treating every criticism as an attack to be repelled. Nozick treated philosophy as genuine exploration. He would propose an argument, examine it from multiple angles, acknowledge its weaknesses, and sometimes conclude that the objections were strong enough to warrant reconsidering the entire position. This intellectual humility was unusual, and sometimes maddening to his critics. How could you debate someone who agreed that his arguments might be wrong? How could you pin down a thinker who treated certainty itself as philosophically suspect? But for Nozick, this openness was not weakness. It was the only honest way to do philosophy. You followed the arguments where they led, even when they led away from positions you had defended. In the early 1970s, as protests raged and the country fractured over questions of war and justice and equality, Nozick sat in his Harvard office working on a response to Rawls. He filled notebooks with arguments, objections, thought experiments. He was building a case for libertarianism that would be rigorous enough to stand alongside Rawls's theory, provocative enough to force even sympathetic readers to question their assumptions. Among the thought experiments he constructed was one involving a machine. It would appear in the book almost as a footnote, a brief illustration in a broader argument, but this particular machine would escape the confines of political philosophy entirely. It would wander into ethics, philosophy of mind, debates about consciousness and reality, and what makes a human life genuinely worth living. Nozick arrived at Harvard just as his colleague John Rawls was completing a book that would reshape political philosophy. The tension between their visions would define an era, and the experience machine would become Nozick's most powerful weapon in that debate. The book arrived in 1974 like a philosophical grenade rolled into a faculty lounge. Anarchy, State, and Utopia was 367 pages of argument that began with a question most political philosophers thought they had settled. Why should there be a state at all? Nozick's answer was as provocative as his question. There should be a state, but only the barest one imaginable, a minimal state limited to protection against force, theft, and fraud. Anything beyond that, any redistribution of wealth or enforcement of equality, violated individual rights so fundamentally that it amounted to forced labor. This was not a book designed to win friends in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the middle of the 1970s. 3 years earlier, Nozick's Harvard colleague John Rawls had published A Theory of Justice, a dense and brilliant work that had instantly become the most important text in political philosophy since John Stuart Mill. Rawls had constructed an elaborate thought experiment of his own. Imagine you are designing a society from behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing what position you would occupy in that society. What principles would you choose? Rawls argued you would choose fairness, equality of opportunity, and a difference principle that permitted inequality only when it benefited the least advantaged. It was egalitarian liberalism given rigorous philosophical foundation, and it dominated the field. Nozick disagreed with nearly every conclusion Rawls reached. Where Rawls saw justice as a pattern of distribution to be achieved and maintained, Nozick saw justice as residing in the process by which people acquired things. If someone earned money through voluntary exchange without violating anyone's rights, that money was theirs absolutely. No social planner, no matter how benevolent, had the right to take it for redistribution. The minimal state could protect your property and enforce contracts. It could not tax you to feed the hungry or educate children or provide healthcare. To do so would be to treat you as a means to collective ends, to use you without your consent. This was libertarianism at its most rigorous and uncompromising. But Nozick did not argue like a politician or an ideologue. He argued like someone genuinely trying to figure out what was true. The book was structured as a series of thought experiments, each designed to pump intuitions and reveal hidden assumptions. He asked you to imagine scenarios and then follow the implications of your responses. Consider the Wilt Chamberlain argument, perhaps the most famous example in the book. Imagine a society that has achieved whatever distribution of wealth you consider just and fair, perfect equality, if you like, or Rawls's difference principle, whatever satisfies your sense of justice. Now suppose that 1 million people each willingly pay Wilt Chamberlain, the basketball star, 25 cents to watch him play. Chamberlain ends up with $250,000. Is he entitled to that money? People gave it to him freely. No one was coerced. Yet now the distribution is no longer equal, no longer whatever pattern you initially endorsed. If you think redistribution is necessary to restore the pattern, Nozick asked, how is that not continuously interfering with people's liberty? How is that not treating Chamberlain and his fans as means to maintaining an abstract distributional scheme? The argument cuts in directions its readers did not always expect. It suggested that pattern principles of justice, those that specify some end-state distribution, are incompatible with liberty. You can have freedom, or you can have enforced equality, but you cannot have both. Nozick was not indifferent to poverty or suffering. He was claiming that rights impose side constraints on action, that there are things we may not do to people, even for beneficial outcomes. You may not force a doctor to provide free care, no matter how desperately someone needs it. You may not take from the rich to give to the poor, no matter how much good it would accomplish. Rights are not utilitarian tools, but boundaries that cannot be crossed. Another thought experiment made the stakes even starker. Imagine a sequence of increasingly intrusive states, Nozick suggested. First, a state that takes 1 hour of your labor each week to fund collective projects. Then one that takes 10 hours, then 20, then 40. At what point does this become slavery? And if 40 hours is slavery, how is 20 hours not partial slavery? The tale of the slave, as it came to be known, was designed to make pattern justice look like creeping bondage, the slow absorption of the individual into collective purposes. Yet buried in the middle of this fiercely libertarian text, in a chapter titled Utopia, Nozick introduced a thought experiment of a very different kind. He was arguing against utilitarianism, against the idea that the right action is whatever produces the greatest total happiness or pleasure. To show that pleasure is not the only thing we value, he asked you to imagine a machine, an experience machine, that could give you any experience you desired, perfectly simulated and indistinguishable from reality. The question was simple: would you plug in for the rest of your life? The experience machine appeared in a book about political philosophy because Nozick's entire project depended on establishing what mattered to people, what they had rights to, what the state could and could not do to them. If people were just pleasure-seeking machines, then perhaps a utilitarian calculus made sense. Perhaps maximizing total happiness justified overriding individual choices. But if people cared about more than pleasure, if they cared about actually doing things, being certain kinds of people, connecting with reality, then end-state principles that focused only on outcomes missed something essential. The machine was not just an argument against hedonism. It was an argument for taking seriously the process by which people live their lives, not just the mental states they end up in. The book won the National Book Award in 1975, a remarkable achievement for a work of academic philosophy. It also ignited fierce controversy. The political left saw it as a defense of callous indifference dressed up in philosophical argument, a justification for letting the poor suffer while the rich kept every penny. Critics pointed out that Nozick's theory seemed to have no room for concern about structural injustice, no way to address the fact that people's starting positions were wildly unequal, through no fault of their own. If your parents were wealthy, you inherited advantages. If they were not, you started life behind. How was that just? Libertarians celebrated the book as a vindication, proof that their political intuitions had rigorous philosophical grounding. Here was an argument that the night watchman state was not just pragmatically preferable but morally required, yet even some libertarians were unsettled by how absolute Nozick's conclusions seemed, how little room remained for collective action or mutual aid. Nozick himself seemed almost surprised by the reactions. He had written the book, he later said, in a state of intense concentration and excitement, following arguments wherever they led. He had not set out to write a libertarian manifesto. He had set out to see if the minimal state could be justified and discovered, at least to his own satisfaction, that it could. But he also acknowledged that the book's conclusions were more extreme than he had initially anticipated, that following rights-based reasoning to its logical end produced results that challenged even his own intuitions. What almost no one noticed at the time was that the experience machine, that brief thought experiment in the middle of a book about taxation and property rights, would outlive all the political arguments surrounding it. The debates about libertarianism and egalitarianism would continue, but they would remain debates, positions held and contested. The experience machine would do something stranger. But one thought experiment from that book escaped the gravitational pull of political debate. The experience machine began to wander through other philosophical territories, asking questions Nozick himself had not fully anticipated. For more than 2,000 years, philosophers had asked what makes life worth living. Some answered virtue, others answered knowledge, or love, or duty to the divine. But one answer kept returning, persistent as hunger, pleasure, the simple, undeniable fact that some experiences feel good and others feel terrible. The hedonists claimed that when you stripped away all the beautiful language and noble posturing, this was what everyone actually pursued. Pleasure was the universal currency. Pain was what everyone fled. Everything else was decoration. This was the view that Nozick's machine was designed to demolish. The philosophical tradition of hedonism stretched back to ancient Greece, where Aristippus of Cyrene declared that bodily pleasure was the highest good. Life was short, the world was uncertain, and the only thing you could be sure of was whether you felt good or bad in this moment. His student Epicurus refined this into something more sophisticated. The goal was not frenzied pleasure-seeking, but rather a calm, steady state of contentment, freedom from pain and disturbance. The highest pleasure was tranquility. Still, pleasure remained the measure of everything. An action was good if it increased pleasure or decreased pain, bad if it did the reverse. There was no other standard. This view never disappeared. It surfaced in different forms across centuries, always with the same basic insight. Human beings are feeling creatures, and feelings are what ultimately matter. In the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes described human life as governed by appetites and aversions, attractions and repulsions. In the 18th century, the French philosophers spoke of enlightened self-interest and the pursuit of happiness. But it was Jeremy Bentham, writing in 1789, who gave hedonism its most systematic and influential form. Bentham was an English lawyer and philosopher who wanted to place morality on a scientific foundation. His answer was radical in its simplicity. Nature, he declared, had placed mankind under two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. They governed everything we did, every decision we made, every judgment we pronounced. The moral quality of an action could be measured precisely by calculating the pleasure and pain it produced. Add up all the pleasure, subtract all the pain, and you had your answer. This was the principle of utility, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Bentham meant this literally. He proposed a hedonic calculus, a method for quantifying pleasure according to its intensity, duration, certainty, and extent. Pleasure was pleasure, whether it came from poetry or pushpin, as he famously insisted. If a crude game brought more measurable happiness than a refined art, then the game was better. There was no room for snobbery about higher and lower pleasures. Pain was bad, pleasure was good, and morality was accounting. His student John Stuart Mill tried to soften this. Mill insisted there were qualitative differences between pleasures, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. But this concession only revealed how difficult it was to maintain pure hedonism once you examined it closely. If some pleasures were higher than others, you were admitting that something beyond mere feeling mattered. You were admitting that the nature or source of pleasure made a difference. Still, utilitarian ethics, the philosophy that actions should be judged by their consequences for happiness, became one of the dominant moral frameworks of the modern world. It shaped economic theory, political reform, public health policy. The logic was appealing. Everyone wanted happiness. An ethical system that maximized happiness seemed obviously correct, even self-evident. What other standard could possibly compete? Nozick's experience machine drove straight into the heart of this edifice. The thought experiment revealed something that surveys and questionnaires would later confirm when actually presented with the choice between maximum pleasure and something else. Nearly everyone chose something else. The machine guaranteed perfect experiential states. Every moment inside would feel exactly like the best moments of your life, or better. No pain, no disappointment, no unfulfilled desires. Pure pleasure, perfectly calibrated to your preferences, forever. And yet, people recoiled. This was not merely a philosophical intuition, it was an empirical fact about human psychology that seemed to refute hedonism directly. If pleasure were truly all that mattered, if experiential states were the only thing we ultimately valued, then refusing the machine would be irrational. It would be like refusing free money, or choosing pain over comfort for no reason. But the refusal was nearly universal. Something in human nature balked at the offer. Nozick identified 3 reasons for this rejection, 3 things we valued that the machine could not provide. First, we want to do certain things, not merely have the experience of doing them. There is a difference between actually writing a novel and merely experiencing what it feels like to write a novel, between genuinely helping a friend and having the sensation of helping while actually doing nothing. The machine offered the experience without the reality, and this mattered to us. We cared about what we actually accomplished in the world, not just what accomplishments felt like from the inside. This suggested something startling. That action itself has value independent of how it makes us feel, that causally affecting the world, making things happen, achieving real results. These have worth beyond their experiential byproducts. A utilitarian might reply that we only care about real action because we have been conditioned to value it, because in the real world, real action is usually necessary for real pleasure. But this seemed like a dodge. The intuition that doing matters was too strong, too immediate, too resistant to this kind of debunking explanation. Second, we want to be a certain way, to be a certain kind of person. Inside the machine, you would not actually be courageous or intelligent or kind. You would merely experience what those qualities feel like. But there is something valuable about actually possessing these traits, about genuinely becoming someone rather than just experiencing the sensation of being someone. The machine could not make you admirable. It could only make you feel as though you were. This revealed that character has intrinsic value, that who we are, not just how we feel, matters fundamentally. An experiential theory of value said that only mental states counted. But if only mental states mattered, then a coward who felt brave would be no different from someone who actually was brave. A fool who felt wise would be no worse off than someone genuinely wise. This seemed wrong. It violated something deep in how we understood human worth. Third, and perhaps most puzzling, we want contact with deeper reality. Not a reality that is merely indistinguishable from the real thing, but actual reality itself. We want to swim in real water, not a simulation of water. To see actual mountains, not neural patterns that look like mountains. To love real people, not programs designed to feel like people. The machine offered perfect verisimilitude, but verisimilitude is not enough. This was the most mysterious of the three reasons. Why should it matter whether something is real or simulated if the experience is identical? If you cannot tell the difference from the inside, what difference could there be? Yet there clearly was a difference. Something in us insisted on it. We cared about truth, about authenticity, about being in genuine contact with a world that existed independently of our perception of it. These three values, doing, being, and experiencing reality, stood outside the hedonic calculus. They could not be reduced to pleasure and pain, and their importance suggested that experiential theories of value, theories that made mental states the sole measure of worth, were missing something essential about human life. The implications rippled outward. If Nozick was right, then utilitarianism faced a serious challenge. You could not determine the rightness of an action simply by calculating its hedonic consequences. You had to consider whether it involved genuine action, whether it shaped real character, whether it connected people to actual reality. The neat arithmetic of pleasure and pain could not capture everything that mattered morally. More fundamentally, the experience machine suggested that human beings were not merely pleasure seekers. We were creatures who cared about truth, about authenticity, about making genuine contact with a world beyond ourselves. We valued certain things, achievement, virtue, reality, not because they maximized our positive experiences, but because they were worth caring about in themselves. This did not mean pleasure was worthless. Pain was still bad, suffering still mattered, happiness still counted, but the machine revealed that they were not the only things that counted. A life could be maximally pleasant and still be missing something crucial. A life could contain suffering and still be profoundly meaningful. The relationship between feeling good and living well was more complicated than the hedonists had imagined. Yet the machine's challenge to hedonism opened a deeper puzzle. If pleasure is not what we ultimately seek, what is? And why does reality itself seem to matter so much? When Nozick proposed his machine, he did not simply present the scenario and leave readers to puzzle out their own reasons for discomfort. He offered three explanations for why nearly everyone recoils from the prospect of permanent immersion, three desires that the machine cannot satisfy no matter how perfectly it stimulates the neurons responsible for pleasure. These three reasons form the philosophical heart of the thought experiment, and they reveal something unexpected about what human beings actually value when the veil of everyday assumptions is pulled away. The first reason sounds almost embarrassingly simple when stated plainly. We want to do things, not merely have the experience of doing them. There is a difference, Nozick insisted, between climbing a mountain and having the vivid, indistinguishable sensation of climbing a mountain while floating in a tank. The machine can give you every sight, every muscle strain, every rush of accomplishment at the summit. It can provide the exact neurological state that corresponds to achievement, but it cannot provide the achievement itself. This distinction cuts deeper than it first appears. Consider a person who has spent years learning to play the violin, struggling through scales and etudes, developing calluses and muscle memory, finally achieving the ability to bring Brahms or Bartók to life. Now imagine someone who plugs into the machine and experiences playing the violin with effortless virtuosity. Both people have identical experiences. Both feel the bow moving across strings, hear the music they are creating, experience the satisfaction of technical mastery. Yet something fundamental separates them. One person can actually play the violin. The other cannot play anything at all. The machine reveals that we care not just about our inner states, but about our relationship to the external world. We want to be authors of our own lives, causes that produce effects in reality. The person who genuinely plays violin has developed a skill, a capacity that exists independently of any particular moment of experience. The person in the machine has only a programmed sensation, disconnected from any real ability or achievement. When the machine is unplugged, one person retains what they have built, the other has nothing. This leads to questions that hedonism cannot easily answer. Why should causation matter? If the experience is identical, if the felt quality of playing music or climbing mountains or falling in love is the same, Why do we care so intensely about which version is real? The machine forces us to admit that we value something beyond pleasure itself, something that has to do with agency, with being an actual force in the world rather than a passive receiver of pre-programmed sensations. The second reason Nozick identifies concerns not what we do, but what we are. We want to be certain kinds of people, to possess particular characteristics and qualities. Someone who cultivates courage, honesty, compassion, or wisdom is not merely seeking the experience of having those virtues. They are seeking to actually embody them, to be constituted in a certain way. The machine can give you the sensation of being courageous, can stimulate the exact feeling of facing fear with resolve, but it cannot make you courageous. Inside the machine, you are not facing anything real. Your response costs nothing, risks nothing, tests nothing. You remain exactly what you were before, someone who wanted to feel brave without actually being brave. This revelation troubles certain modern intuitions. We live in an age that often treats character as performance, virtue as a matter of appearing a certain way, or feeling certain emotions. The experience machine strips away that comfortable confusion. It shows that authenticity is not a fashionable concern, but a fundamental human value. We do not want to seem courageous or kind or wise. We want those qualities to be genuine features of who we are, tested and developed through actual engagement with reality. The machine makes vivid something philosophers have long debated, whether virtues are instrumental goods, valuable only for the pleasant states they produce, or intrinsic goods, valuable in themselves. If courage matters only because it makes us feel good, then simulated courage should satisfy us. That it does not suggest we care about the substance of our character, not merely its phenomenological side effects. A person in the machine might experience themselves as deeply virtuous while remaining, in actuality, nothing more than an inert body connected to electrodes. The horror of this prospect reveals how much we value being something real. The third reason strikes at the deepest level. We want contact with deeper reality, Nozick argues, not an artificial construct no matter how convincing. We want to live in the actual world, the world as it genuinely is, rather than in an invented fantasy designed to please us. This desire seems almost perverse from a hedonistic perspective. Why should the source of our experiences matter if the experiences themselves are perfect? Why prefer a difficult, unpredictable, often painful reality to a flawlessly calibrated simulation? Yet the preference is nearly universal. Even if the machine could give you a life of sustained fulfillment, meaningful relationships, creative achievement, and profound joy, something rebels at the prospect. That rebellion tells us something the machine cannot provide, the knowledge that what we encounter is really there, that the world we experience has existence independent of our desires, that we are embedded in something larger and more fundamental than our own consciousness. This third reason opens questions that extend far beyond the immediate thought experiment. What makes reality valuable? Not its capacity to produce pleasure, clearly, since the machine produces pleasure more efficiently, not its convenience or safety, since simulated reality could be designed to eliminate all risk and frustration. Reality seems valuable precisely because it is not designed for us, not shaped by our preferences, not guaranteed to satisfy. It pushes back. It exists on its own terms. Our contact with it means something because it is not an echo of ourselves, but genuinely other. The machine reveals that we want truth, even uncomfortable truth. We want authenticity, even when authenticity is harder than illusion. We want causal connection to the world, the sense that our actions have purchase on something real, rather than merely triggering pre-programmed responses in a closed system. These values cannot be reduced to pleasure or comfort or satisfaction. They seem to constitute a different category of good entirely. Nozick did not claim to fully explain why these three desires matter so much. His argument was more modest and more powerful. These desires exist, they are widely shared, and no amount of pleasure can compensate for their frustration. The experience machine, therefore, refutes any ethical theory that makes pleasure or positive mental states the sole measure of what matters. Whatever human flourishing means, It cannot mean merely feeling good. It must involve actually doing things, actually being someone, actually engaging with what is genuinely real. The implications spread outward from ethics into metaphysics, epistemology, and theories of meaning. If we care so deeply about reality itself, then questions about what is real become questions about what can make life worthwhile. If authenticity matters, then questions about self-knowledge and self-creation move to the center of human concern. If agency and causation are fundamental values, then determinism and free will become more than abstract puzzles. The machine, in revealing what we want, reveals what we believe about the universe and our place in it. These intuitions about reality and authenticity had ancient roots. The experience machine, it turned out, was asking the same question Plato had asked 2,000 years earlier in a cave. The experience machine asks whether you would choose a life of perfect illusion over imperfect reality. But this question has been asked before. 24 centuries before Nozick published his thought experiment, another philosopher posed nearly the same dilemma, in nearly the same terms. He set it not in a laboratory but in a cave, and instead of a machine that stimulates the brain, he imagined chains that prevent the body from turning around. The technology differed. The question did not. Plato wrote the allegory of the cave around 380 BCE as part of his dialogue, The Republic. In it, he describes prisoners who have been chained since childhood in an underground cavern, facing a blank wall. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners, who have never seen anything else, believe the shadows are reality itself. They give the shadows names. They track their patterns. They become experts in shadow prediction, earning prestige among their fellow prisoners for their knowledge of the shadow world. Then one prisoner is freed, dragged up the steep passage toward the surface. He is blinded by the light, confused by the three-dimensional objects that cast the shadows he once studied. The journey is painful. His eyes hurt. He wants to return to the comfortable darkness, where he understood what he saw, but gradually his vision adjusts. He sees trees, mountains, the sky. Eventually, he can look at the sun itself and understand that this is the source of all light, the cause of all the shadows below. He realizes that everything he thought he knew was a pale reflection of something more real. The freed prisoner faces a choice that mirrors the one Nozick would pose millennia later. He can return to the cave and try to free his fellow prisoners, or he can remain in the sunlit world above. If he returns, his eyes will need time to adjust to the darkness. The other prisoners, still experts in shadows, will mock him for his temporary blindness. They will think the journey up has ruined him. If he tries to free them, to drag them toward a reality they do not want and cannot yet see, they might kill him for the attempt. Plato intended the allegory as a story about knowledge and education, about the philosopher's duty to return to the cave and guide others toward truth. But nested within it is a question about value. The shadows provide a complete world for those who have never known anything else. They create a system of meaning, a hierarchy of expertise, relationships, and rivalries. The shadow world is comfortable in its predictability. The journey upward is disorienting and painful. Yet Plato assumes without argument that the prisoner should make the journey, that the sunlit world is better than the shadow world, that reality matters more than comfortable illusion. This assumption is precisely what the experience machine tests. Imagine Plato's freed prisoner standing in the sunlight, offered a choice: return to the upper world permanently, with all its harsh light and complex truth, or descend to a new kind of cave where the shadows are so perfectly rendered, so rich and satisfying, that they cannot be distinguished from the reality above. Would the prisoner who has seen the sun choose to watch shadows again, knowing they are shadows, if those shadows could be made perfect? The structure of the two thought experiments aligns with eerie precision. Both present a choice between comfortable illusion and uncomfortable reality. Both assume that most people, given full information about what they are choosing, would choose reality. Both use that choice to argue for something beyond immediate experience. For Plato, the reality of the forms; for Nozick, the insufficiency of hedonism. Both suggest that human beings are oriented towards something other than mere pleasure or satisfaction. that we want our lives to connect to what is actually real, even when that connection costs us comfort. Yet there is a difference. Plato's prisoners do not know they are watching shadows. Their illusion is not chosen but imposed. The freed prisoner, having seen the truth, cannot simply decide to believe the shadows are real again. Knowledge has changed him. He can return to the cave physically, but he cannot return to the innocent mistake of thinking shadows are solid things. The experience machine, by contrast, requires a choice made with full knowledge. You know the machine is not real. You choose illusion consciously, trading reality for superior experience. The question is not whether you can know the truth, but whether truth matters if the lie feels better. This distinction marks a shift in philosophical concern that would become explicit in the 17th century, when René Descartes sat in a room by a fire and wondered whether he could be certain of anything at all. In his Meditations on First Philosophy, published in 1641, Descartes proposed a thought experiment that has disturbed philosophy ever since. Suppose there is an evil demon, supremely powerful and clever, who has dedicated itself to deceiving you. This demon controls all your experiences, feeding you sensations of sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, none of which correspond to anything real. You think you are reading these words, sitting where you sit, inhabiting the body you believe you have. But perhaps the demon is simply giving you the experience of reading, of sitting, of embodiment, while the truth is utterly different from anything you can imagine. Descartes used this hypothesis to push skepticism to its limit, to find what, if anything, remains certain when everything else is doubted. His answer, cogito, ergo sum, I think therefore I am, is less relevant here than the demon itself, which is really a philosophical machine that generates experiences. The demon is doing manually what Nozick's machine does technologically, producing a seamless simulation of reality that cannot be distinguished from the inside. But Descartes was asking an epistemological question. How can I know what is real? Can I be certain I am not deceived? His concern was with the justification of belief, the foundations of knowledge, the criteria for distinguishing true from false. The thought experiment revealed how fragile our knowledge claims are, how much we rely on assumptions that might be wrong. Philosophers after Descartes spent centuries trying to answer the skeptical challenge his demon posed. Nozick's machine asks something different. Assume you can know whether you are in the machine or not. The machine's designers tell you exactly what it does. You are choosing with full knowledge. The question is not can you know the truth, but does the truth matter? This is not an epistemological question, but an ethical and existential one. What makes a life good? What should we value? Is a fully simulated life worth living if it feels exactly like a real one? The shift from Descartes to Nozick mirrors a broader shift in philosophy, from concerns about knowledge to concerns about meaning. The ancient and early modern philosophers worried about distinguishing reality from appearance because they needed to know what was true. By the 20th century, with skepticism about skepticism and a pragmatic turn in philosophy, the question became not whether we can know reality, but whether reality matters even if we can know it. The machine assumes away the epistemological problem to isolate the value problem underneath. This is why Nozick's thought experiment has proven more persistently troubling than Descartes' demon. We have, in a sense, answered Descartes. We have learned to live with the impossibility of absolute certainty, to build knowledge on foundations we acknowledge are not incorrigible. But we have not answered Nozick. We have not explained why the source of an experience matters if the experience itself is perfect. We have not articulated what it is about reality that makes it valuable beyond the experiences it provides. The cave, the demon, the machine, three versions of the same basic structure, each revealing something different about what troubles us. Plato's prisoners are tragic because they do not know they are deceived. Descartes' meditator is troubled because he cannot prove he is not deceived. Nozick's potential machine user is puzzling because he refuses deception even when it would make him perfectly happy. The progression shows philosophy moving from the problem of ignorance through the problem of certainty to the problem of meaning itself. And perhaps this is why the experience machine has outlived its original purpose as an argument against hedonism. It connects to the oldest questions in philosophy: what is real? What can we know? What should we value? While pointing toward new questions about technology, consciousness, and the futures we are building. The machine is both ancient and urgent, both a restatement of Plato's cave and a preview of virtual worlds not yet invented. But if the experience machine had ancient echoes, it also had prophetic ones. Within decades of Nozick's thought experiment, technology would begin building the machine he had only imagined. When Ivan Sutherland stood before a room of engineers in 1968 and described what he called the ultimate display, he was not thinking about philosophy. He was thinking about pixels and cathode rays, about head-mounted screens and motion tracking, about building a window into mathematical spaces that did not exist. But what he described that day was, in essence, Nozick's machine, a device that could present any sensory information, a room within which the computer could control the existence of matter. 6 years before Nozick published his thought experiment, computer scientists had already begun constructing it. The first virtual reality systems were crude beyond recognition, head-mounted displays that weighed as much as a small child, tethered to mainframe computers by thick cables, graphics rendered in simple wireframe, angular and ghostly, latency so severe that turning your head meant watching the world slowly catch up, inducing nausea within minutes. But the principle was there. The human visual system, it turned out, could be fooled. Show the eyes slightly different images, update them as the head moves, and the brain constructs a sense of presence in a space that does not exist. The machine was possible. Through the 1980s and 90s, the technology improved incrementally. Jaron Lanier coined the term virtual reality in 1987 and founded VPL Research, selling gloves and goggles to researchers and enthusiasts. The equipment remained expensive, cumbersome, isolating, but something had shifted. What began as a tool for flight simulators and architectural visualization became an object of broader fascination. Here was technology that did not merely process information or display it. It created experience itself. It manufactured presence. By the 2000s, the machine had miniaturized enough to become almost mundane. Video game consoles rendered three-dimensional worlds with increasing fidelity. Massively multiplayer online games allowed millions to inhabit persistent virtual spaces, building identities and relationships that felt as real as those in physical space. Social media platforms offered curated streams of experience, algorithmically optimized to maximize engagement. The stimulation was not yet neural, not yet direct, but it was powerful. Millions spent hours each day in carefully constructed experiential environments designed to feel better than ordinary life. Then neuroscience began catching up to the science fiction. Deep brain stimulation, developed initially to treat Parkinson's disease, demonstrated that electrodes placed in specific brain regions could alter mood, motivation, even personality. Researchers mapped the neural correlates of pleasure with increasing precision, identifying circuits in the ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens that, when activated, produced sensations of reward and satisfaction. The technology was medical, cautiously applied, tightly regulated, but the principle was proven. You could stimulate experience directly. In 2008, a team at Stanford University used transcranial magnetic stimulation to temporarily enhance subjects' performance on cognitive tasks, effectively making them temporarily more intelligent by altering neural firing patterns. Other laboratories explored optogenetics, using light to control genetically modified neurons with extraordinary precision. Brain-computer interfaces allowed paralyzed patients to move robotic limbs through thought alone, establishing direct channels between neural activity and external effect. The boundary between brain and machine began to blur. None of this, of course, approached what Nozick had imagined. No technology could yet simulate the full richness of embodied experience. No interface could provide the seamless, undetectable immersion his thought experiment required. But the trajectory was clear. The experience machine was no longer purely hypothetical. It was an engineering challenge, progressing year by year, breakthrough by incremental breakthrough. This created a philosophical problem of a new kind. When Nozick posed his question in 1974, the machine existed only in thought. Intuitions about it could remain pure, uncontaminated by practical considerations. But as virtual experiences became real, those intuitions grew complicated. People who insisted they would never plug into Nozick's machine spent hours each evening in virtual worlds, pursuing simulated achievements, maintaining relationships with people they had never met in physical space. The rejection of the machine seemed absolute in theory but negotiable in practice. Consider video games, which by the 2010s had become a dominant form of entertainment, generating more revenue than film and music combined. Players invested hundreds of hours building characters, exploring detailed virtual environments, experiencing narratives of heroism and discovery. Were these experiences valuable? Most people who played seemed to think so. They spoke of games that had moved them, taught them, connected them to others, yet the experiences were entirely simulated. The dragons were not real. The worlds did not exist. By Nozick's logic, none of it should matter. Or consider social media, which by 2020 had reorganized how billions of humans experienced daily life. People curated digital identities, crafted to project success and happiness. They consumed streams of content algorithmically selected to maximize engagement, often at the cost of accuracy or nuance. They formed relationships through text and image, sometimes never meeting in physical space. The platforms were designed explicitly and scientifically to be addictive, to capture attention, to make users feel they could not leave. Was this a kind of experience machine? Were users in some sense already plugged in? The question troubled philosophers in new ways. If virtual experiences could be genuinely valuable, perhaps Nozick's thought experiment did not prove what he thought it proved. Perhaps our rejection of his machine was not about reality itself, but about other features, the permanence, the isolation, the loss of autonomy. If you could enter and leave virtual worlds at will, maintain relationships across both domains, retain control over your experiences, would the objection still hold? Was reality itself the value, or was it something else reality usually provided that could potentially be found elsewhere? Some philosophers argued that virtual experiences were genuinely valuable when they involved real connection and achievement. A friendship formed in a virtual world was still a real friendship if both parties were genuine people, truly interacting. Solving a puzzle in a video game was a real cognitive achievement even if the puzzle did not exist in physical space. The experiences were mediated differently, but they remained real experiences happening to real minds. Reality on this view was not about the substrate but about what actually occurred. Others remained unconvinced. Virtual achievements felt hollow, they argued, precisely because they were constructed to be achievable, designed to provide satisfaction without genuine risk or difficulty. Virtual relationships lacked the embodied vulnerability of physical presence, the stakes of actual proximity. The value of reality was not merely that experiences happened, but that they happened in a world that was not designed for us, that existed independently of our desires, that could genuinely surprise or thwart or challenge us in ways no simulation ever could. By the 2020s, the distinctions had become genuinely difficult to pass. Augmented reality overlaid digital information on physical space, blending the virtual and real. Neural interfaces allowed thought to control external devices. People conducted significant portions of their lives through screens, experiencing mediated versions of events filtered through platforms optimized for engagement rather than accuracy. The question was no longer whether we would plug into an experience machine. It was whether we already had, incrementally, without quite noticing the transition. As the machine became less science fiction and more engineering problem, philosophers began to reconsider Nozick's thought experiment. Perhaps the intuitions it revealed were not as clear as they first appeared. The experience machine convinced philosophers for decades, but thought experiments do not get the final word simply because they produce strong intuitions. Within years of Nozick's book appearing, critics began dismantling the machine from unexpected angles. The intuition that we would refuse to plug in, so clear, so visceral, so seemingly decisive, might reveal nothing about reality or authenticity at all. It might simply reveal how human psychology responds to hypothetical scenarios. The machine remained influential precisely because the objections against it proved nearly as fascinating as the thought experiment itself. The first major challenge arrived as the status quo bias objection. Perhaps we reject the experience machine not because we value reality over illusion, but because the scenario asks us to imagine making a dramatic change. Human beings exhibit profound resistance to departures from their current situation, even when the alternative promises improvement. Studies in behavioral economics have demonstrated this tendency repeatedly. People demand more money to give up something they own than they would pay to acquire that same thing in the first place. The endowment effect, loss aversion, the preference for familiar devils over unknown angels, all pointed toward a cognitive architecture that defaults to preservation rather than transformation. Applied to the experience machine, this objection carried weight. Nozick asks you to imagine abandoning your actual life, severing every connection, walking away from everything you know. The machine offers pleasure and fulfillment, but it demands you cross a threshold of irreversible change. No wonder people recoil. The thought experiment might reveal nothing deeper than our evolutionary wiring against risk and disruption. Test subjects who refuse the machine might accept it readily if the question were reversed. If you were already inside, would you choose to leave? The asymmetry would suggest that our intuitions track not the value of reality itself, but merely our position relative to it. Philosophers proposed modifications to test this hypothesis. Imagine you have not yet been born. You stand before two doors. One leads to ordinary embodied life with all its unpredictability and pain, the other to existence inside the experience machine from your first moment of consciousness. No departure from the familiar, no loss of established connections, simply a choice between two modes of existence. If people still chose the ordinary world, that might vindicate Nozick's deeper point, but the thought experiment had already been complicated. The intuitions it generated now appeared less stable, more vulnerable to framing effects and presentation order. A second objection emerged from the poverty of Nozick's description. The experience machine as originally conceived remained frustratingly vague about crucial details. You float in a tank, electrodes stimulating your brain to produce any experience you desire. But what do you desire? Who chooses? If you select specific experiences before plugging in, you face the obvious problem that your current self might choose poorly for your future self. If the machine somehow reads and fulfills your preferences as they evolve, it begins to resemble something much more sophisticated than Nozick's scenario suggested. And if the machine gives you a rich, complex, evolving life indistinguishable from reality, complete with challenges, growth, relationships that develop organically, why exactly would that be inferior to the same experiences outside the tank? The problem intensified when philosophers examined what Nozick meant by pre-programmed experiences. A life where you know the script in advance would indeed feel hollow, but the machine need not work that way. Imagine instead that it generates experiences according to complex algorithms, creating genuine surprises, authentic emotional responses, relationships that truly challenge and change you. You would not know what happens next any more than you know what happens next in ordinary life. The simulation would be not just perceptually but structurally identical to reality. At that point, the distinction between inside and outside the machine becomes philosophical rather than experiential. And if the distinction is purely philosophical, a matter of metaphysical category rather than lived difference, perhaps our intuitions about the scenario reveal mere prejudice rather than insight. This led directly to the social connection objection. Perhaps what troubles us about the experience machine has nothing to do with reality or authenticity as abstract values. Perhaps we reject it because plugging in means abandoning everyone we love, your family, your friends, everyone who depends on you. They all remain outside while you float in solitary simulation. Even if the machine provides you with simulated loved ones who behave identically to real people, you know that your actual mother, your actual partner, your actual children continue existing without you. The moral weight of that abandonment might drive the intuition rather than any concern about reality itself. Test this by modifying the scenario. Everyone you care about will also enter the machine. Your relationships will continue inside. indistinguishable from how they would have unfolded outside. You will still challenge each other, hurt each other, forgive each other, grow old together. Does the objection to the machine weaken? For many philosophers considering this variant, the answer was yes. The scenario suddenly seemed less obviously objectionable. If social bonds could be preserved, if no one was abandoned or betrayed, the machine's appeal increased substantially. This suggested that Nozick's thought experiment might have been testing our commitment to relationships rather than our commitment to reality. Philosophers began generating alternative machines, each designed to isolate different aspects of the original scenario. The genetic experience machine would hardwire you from birth to experience only pleasure, without requiring any departure from ordinary embodied life. Would you choose that for yourself if you could decide before conception? For a child you plan to have, the intuitions here divided more sharply than with the original machine, suggesting that authenticity and reality mattered differently depending on how the question was posed. The result machine represented another variation. Rather than giving you the experience of achievement, it would simply produce the achievements themselves while you floated unconscious. You would wake to discover you had written brilliant novels, proved mathematical theorems, raised accomplished children, all while your brain was on pause. Most people rejected this even more forcefully than the experience machine. Apparently we value the doing itself, not merely the having done, but this created puzzles of its own. If lived experience matters, why reject perfect simulated experience? If accomplishment matters, why reject real accomplishment achieved without your conscious participation? The living and growing machine offered yet another twist. Unlike Nozick's static pleasure generator, this machine would allow genuine development over time. You would face challenges calibrated to stretch your abilities, relationships that evolved based on authentic responses, a simulated life that was in every meaningful sense a real life, except for happening inside a machine. The philosopher Felipe de Brigard tested intuitions about this scenario empirically. When subjects were asked to imagine they were already in such a machine and could choose to leave for a potentially worse reality outside, many preferred to stay. The results suggested that our attachment to reality might be weaker than our attachment to the particular life we believe ourselves to be living, wherever that life happens to occur. Some philosophers argued that all these variations and objections vindicated hedonism after all. If we reject the experience machine because of status quo bias, impoverished description, or social abandonment rather than because reality itself matters intrinsically, then Nozick's refutation of hedonism fails. Perhaps pleasure and positive experience are what ultimately matter, and our apparent concern with reality reflects not a deep value, but a collection of cognitive quirks and contingent moral commitments. The debate spiraled outward, generating papers and responses, counterexamples and revised scenarios, each attempting to isolate the precise intuition Nozick had tapped. What became clear was that the experience machine had revealed not one stable intuition, but a cluster of related concerns, some more robust than others, some potentially reducible to other values. The thought experiment remained powerful, but its power was now understood to be complex and multifaceted. It could not simply be deployed as a decisive refutation of hedonism. It required careful interpretation, constant refinement, willingness to acknowledge that intuitions shift when scenarios are reformulated. The machine that seemed to deliver a knockout blow turned out to have thrown a punch that connected, but did not end the fight. Even Nozick himself in later years stepped back from some of his earlier certainties. The philosopher who built the machine began to question what he had built. 15 years after Denarchy, State and Utopia made him famous, Robert Nozick published a book that surprised nearly everyone who read it. The Examined Life, released in 1989, contained something rare in academic philosophy, a public reconsideration of positions the author had previously defended with confidence. The libertarian firebrand had softened. The defender of absolute property rights now wrote about love, community, and the ways individuals are constituted by their connections to others. Critics who had spent years attacking his earlier work found themselves disarmed by his willingness to question his own conclusions. Admirers who had built careers on his libertarian foundations felt something like betrayal. Nozick himself seemed unbothered by either reaction. He had changed his mind about some things, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The shift was not a wholesale abandonment of his earlier views. Nozick did not renounce the minimal state or declare himself a socialist, but the tone had changed entirely. Where not, anarchy, state, and utopia built rigorous arguments from foundational principles. Set, the examined life, meandered through questions with the casualness of someone thinking aloud. Chapters were short, often just a few pages. Some posed questions without answering them. Others offered tentative suggestions that Nozick himself seemed to doubt even as he wrote them. The book read less like a philosophical treatise and more like a journal of uncertainty, as if Nozick had decided that honesty about his own confusion was more valuable than the appearance of systematic certainty. What had changed? Partly it was age and experience. Nozick was now in his 50s, no longer the brilliant young provocateur, but a senior professor who had seen how ideas played out in the world. The 1980s had been the decade of Reaganism and Thatcherism, when libertarian economic ideas moved from philosophy departments into government policy. Nozick watched as arguments he had made in the abstract became political realities, and he was not entirely pleased with what he saw. Tax cuts that were supposed to liberate creative energy seemed also to concentrate wealth and erode social cohesion. The minimal state in practice looked different from the minimal state in theory. He began to wonder whether his earlier work had been too focused on rights and too little concerned with the texture of actual human flourishing. The examined life grappled explicitly with what the earlier book had treated as peripheral: the importance of relationships, the value of community, the ways individuals are shaped by and dependent on others. Nozick wrote about marriage not as a contract between autonomous agents, but as a fusion that creates something new, a union that transcends the individuals who enter it. He explored the concept of symbolic meaning, the way objects and gestures and shared histories create bonds that cannot be reduced to individual preferences or utility functions. He admitted that his earlier emphasis on individual rights, while not wrong, had been incomplete. People are not just rights-bearing atoms in social space. They are nodes in networks of meaning and care, and those networks are not optional add-ons to an essentially solitary existence. They are constitutive of who we are. This shift was not merely political but methodological. Nozick began to question the entire project of building philosophical systems from first principles. In a remarkable passage, he wrote about the appeal of philosophical proof, the desire to demonstrate with logical certainty that some position must be correct. He confessed that he had once been drawn to that kind of philosophy, the kind that aspired to deliver knockdown arguments that no rational person could resist. But he had come to see such aspirations as misguided. Philosophy, he now believed, was not like mathematics. It could not prove its conclusions in the same definitive way. Philosophical arguments might illuminate, clarify, reveal implications, expose tensions, but they could not force agreement, and that was acceptable. Perhaps it was even valuable, a philosophy that left room for exploration, for multiple perspectives, for provisional conclusions might be closer to the truth than one that claimed to have settled everything. This humility was unusual, bordering on radical. Most philosophers, when they change their minds, either keep quiet about it or present the new view as if they had always held it. Academic culture rewards consistency, or at least the appearance of it, admitting error, reconsidering arguments, exploring without reaching conclusions. These are not moves that enhance one's reputation for rigor. Nozick did it anyway. He seemed genuinely unconcerned with whether people thought his later work was weaker or less systematic than his earlier contributions. He was interested in questions, not in defending positions he no longer fully believed. Yet for all the changes, something remained constant. Nozick never abandoned his conviction that thought experiments reveal deep truths about human values. Die Sabende Life contained new thought experiments alongside the famous ones from his earlier work. He asked readers to imagine various scenarios, testing intuitions, probing what remained stable and what shifted as details changed. The experience machine was still there, still doing its work, But now it appeared in a different context, surrounded by reflections on meaning and connection that Nozick had not fully articulated before. The machine still demonstrated that we value reality over mere experience, that authenticity matters in ways hedonism cannot explain. But Nozick now emphasized a dimension he had mentioned only briefly in 1974. The machine severs us from genuine relationships with others. Inside the machine, you might experience what feels like love, friendship, collaboration, but those experiences would not connect you to actual other people. The love would not be reciprocated by anyone real. The friendships would not involve genuine mutual concern. The connections would be simulations, and that mattered. This emphasis on relationship fit with the broader shift in Nozick's thinking. He was moving away from a philosophy centered on individual rights and toward one that recognized how deeply embedded we are in webs of mutual dependency and care. The experience machine, read through this lens, was not just a refutation of hedonism, but a demonstration that human values are reducibly social. We do not merely want pleasure or even reality in the abstract. We want connection to actual others, participation in shared projects, recognition from people who genuinely see us. The machine cannot provide these things because it cannot provide the one thing that makes them valuable: the presence of other conscious beings whose responses are not scripted for our benefit. Nozick's later work also explored questions of meaning in a more sustained way than his earlier writing had. He wrote about how lives acquire meaning through narrative, through the stories we tell about who we are and what we are doing. He discussed the importance of holistic values, goods that cannot be decomposed into smaller units without losing what makes them valuable. A meaningful life, he suggested, is not just a collection of pleasant moments or accomplished goals. It is a coherent whole, shaped by choices and relationships and commitments that hang together in ways that matter. This was a long distance from the atomistic individualism some critics had read into Fowles' anarchy, state and utopia. Nozick had not reversed himself entirely, but he had complicated his earlier picture considerably. Some philosophers saw this later work as a kind of defeat, an admission that the rigorous argumentative approach of his first book could not be sustained. Others saw it as growth, the natural trajectory of a thinker who took his own questions seriously enough to keep asking them. Nozick himself seemed content with the ambiguity. He had always been drawn to philosophy as a way of exploring what mattered, and exploration meant being willing to change direction when the territory revealed something unexpected. If that made his oeuvre less systematic than Kant's or Rawls's, so be it. He was after truth, not consistency for its own sake. What is striking looking back is how few philosophers have followed Nozick's example of public reconsideration. Academic philosophy rewards the appearance of having figured things out, of having positions one can defend against all comers, admitting genuine uncertainty, revising substantial parts of one's earlier work, treating philosophy as an open-ended inquiry rather than a system of doctrines. These moves remain rare. Nozick did not start a trend, but he demonstrated something important: that intellectual honesty and philosophical depth are not incompatible, that it is possible to change one's mind without undermining the value of the earlier work. That exploration itself can be a kind of achievement. Nozick died in 2002, but the machine he imagined has lived on, multiplying through philosophy papers, cognitive science labs, and Silicon Valley pitch decks. Its question has only grown more urgent. 50 years after Nozick first posed his question, the experience machine has outlived most philosophical thought experiments from its era. While countless arguments about justice and rights have faded into historical footnotes, this single hypothetical device continues to generate academic papers, neuroscience studies, and late-night debates. The question has migrated beyond philosophy departments into psychology labs, artificial intelligence research centers, and Silicon Valley boardrooms. It appears in undergraduate syllabi and graduate seminars, in popular science books and science fiction novels. The machine refuses to become dated, because every year the world grows closer to building it. The thought experiment's persistence stems partly from its elegant simplicity. Unlike intricate philosophical arguments that require pages of background, the experience machine can be explained in 2 minutes to anyone. A device that gives you perfect experiences, indistinguishable from reality. Would you plug in? The question arrives clean and sharp, and the intuition it provokes arrives just as quickly. Most people say no. That simple fact, that nearly universal rejection of guaranteed happiness, continues to puzzle philosophers half a century later. But the machine endures for deeper reasons than simplicity. It sits at the intersection of questions that matter more now than when Nozick first wrote. Questions about virtual reality and its psychological effects. Questions about artificial intelligence and whether digital minds could have genuine experiences. Questions about social media, video games, and the increasingly immersive technologies that promise to deliver experiences more vivid than ordinary life provides. The hypothetical machine Nozick imagined has become steadily less hypothetical. Consider virtual reality technology as it has developed since the 1980s. Early systems produced crude simulations, blocky graphics that fooled no one, but each generation has brought higher resolution, lower latency, more convincing physics. Modern virtual reality can induce genuine vertigo, authentic fear, real aesthetic pleasure. Users forget they are wearing headsets. The gap between simulation and reality narrows steadily, and researchers work explicitly toward experiences indistinguishable from physical presence. They are building the experience machine incrementally, one technical advance at a time. The philosophical questions multiply accordingly. If virtual experiences become truly indistinguishable from physical ones, does the distinction still matter? Nozick assumed we would reject the machine because we value reality itself. But what if the simulated experience is genuinely identical in every measurable way to the real one? A virtual mountain climb that produces exactly the same neural states, the same sense of accomplishment, the same memories. Does the fact that the mountain was made of code rather than stone rob the experience of value? Some philosophers now argue yes, others argue no, and the debate has escaped the realm of pure speculation. Brain-computer interfaces add another layer of complexity. Researchers can already stimulate pleasure centers directly, inducing euphoria through electrical signals. They can suppress pain, enhance focus, alter mood through precise interventions. These technologies remain primitive compared to Nozick's imagined machine, but they demonstrate the principle experience can be manufactured. The question becomes not whether such technology is possible, but whether we should use it once it arrives. And that returns us to Nozick's original puzzle. Even if we can guarantee happiness through direct neural stimulation, should we? The simulation hypothesis takes the thought experiment in an even more unsettling direction. Philosophers and physicists have seriously explored the possibility that we already inhabit something like an experience machine. If it is possible to create convincing simulations, and if civilizations tend to create many such simulations, then statistical reasoning suggests we are more likely to be inside a simulation than outside one. We might already be plugged in, our entire experienced reality, a program running on some unimaginable computer, created by beings whose nature we cannot grasp. The experience machine becomes not a choice we might face, but a condition we might already occupy. This possibility transforms Nozick's thought experiment in strange ways. If we might already be simulated, then our intuitive rejection of the machine becomes harder to interpret. Perhaps what we actually value is not contact with base reality, whatever that might be, but rather the feeling of authenticity within whatever level of reality we happen to inhabit. We reject the machine not because it is simulated, but because we know it is simulated. The knowledge of artificiality, not artificiality itself, drains experience of meaning. Yet this interpretation only deepens the puzzle. Why should knowledge of the source matter if the experience itself remains identical? A beautiful sunset produces the same visual experience whether the light comes from a real star or a sophisticated projection. The joy of friendship feels the same whether your friend is biological or digital. If we reject experiences solely because we know their origin, we seem to be caring about something other than the experiences themselves. We are back to Nozick's original insight: pleasure and positive mental states cannot be all we value. What the experience machine ultimately reveals through 50 years of debate and refinement is that human beings are meaning makers rather than pleasure seekers. We do not simply want to feel good. We want our feelings to be about something real. We want our accomplishments to have actually occurred. We want the people we love to genuinely exist. We want to be truly brave, not merely to experience bravery. The machine offers feelings without reference, experiences unmoored from reality, and we instinctively refuse because we recognize that would be a kind of death, not physical death, but the death of mattering. This insight has profound implications for how we think about consciousness and value. It suggests that subjective experience, despite its undeniable importance, cannot be the sole source of what makes life meaningful. Meaning requires connection to a world beyond the self. It requires that our experiences track reality, that our actions have genuine consequences, that we participate in something larger than our own mental states. The hedonistic assumption that experience is all that matters crashes against the stubborn human conviction that truth and reality matter too. The machine functions as a mirror, reflecting what we believe about ourselves. Our rejection reveals values we might struggle to articulate, but cannot deny. We value authenticity, even when we cannot always detect its presence. We value causal connection to reality, even when simulation becomes perfect. We value the difference between doing something and merely dreaming we did it, even when the dream feels exactly the same. These values resist easy justification, yet they persist. The experience machine shows us that we are creatures who need more than good feelings. We need those feelings to mean something. Artificial intelligence and digital consciousness add yet another dimension to these questions. If we create artificial minds capable of genuine experience, can those minds have meaningful lives despite their digital substrate? Would an artificial intelligence living in a completely simulated world have less reason to reject an experience machine than biological humans do? Or would digital consciousness face the same questions about authenticity and reality that we do? These are no longer distant speculations but immediate concerns as technology advances toward creating minds not born from evolution. The enduring power of Nozick's thought experiment lies in its refusal to provide easy answers. 50 years of philosophical analysis have complicated the original scenario, raised new objections, proposed modifications, and challenged the intuitions it supposedly reveals. Yet the basic question remains as troubling as ever. A machine that could give you any experience you desire, perfect happiness, perfectly simulated, would you plug in? Most people still say no, despite being unable to fully explain why. That stubborn rejection suggests something profound about human values that we have not yet managed to articulate completely. We glimpse in that refusal some truth about what makes life worth living, even as the truth stays just beyond our ability to capture in words. The machine offers everything we claim to want, and something within us insists that would not be enough. Perhaps the deepest insight is not what the thought experiment proves, but what it reveals about the limits of proof. Philosophy often seeks to demonstrate conclusions through airtight arguments, but the experience machine works differently. It appeals to intuition, to immediate recognition, to something we feel more clearly than we can explain. That does not make it less valuable. Sometimes thought experiments serve not to prove theories, but to show us what we believe before theory begins. The machine sits there still, in the realm of pure thought, waiting with its promise of perfect happiness and its single terrible question.